Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming to my very first course. It's the first time I'm doing this. I'm a little bit nervous. You'll have to excuse me if I stutter a bit. But thank you for coming. This course is going to be based on a book that I'm almost finished writing. It's called The Complete Guide to Forming Communities for Mutual Aid, Support, and Charity. And despite the fact that it sounds kind of happy and upbeat, it is actually a deadly serious course that I'm about to present, because this course is going to make the difference between life and death for many of us. Now, I know that sounds really extreme, but let me explain by taking you on a trip to how I arrived at this book and why I started writing it. So, I was born in 1957, which makes me a child of the 60s, a teenager in the 70s, a young man in the 80s, and already middle-aged by the 90s. But the 60s were wonderful. They were just as wonderful as you see in the old movies and from what you've heard, the stories. Those were great times. It was a wonderful time to be alive, and it was a wonderful time to be a kid. There was only one exception to that, and that was we had the sword of Damocles hanging over our head in the form of a nuclear annihilation. In 1962, I was just almost 6 years old. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, for those who don't know or didn't study the Cuban Missile Crisis, this was the closest time in history that the world came to the edge of nuclear annihilation. My parents bought a house in the following year, and one of the options on buying a new house was a nuclear fallout shelter in the backyard. That's how serious people treated the conditions at the time. And even though I was just a little kid, I remember the parents were all pretty nervous. They would talk in hushed voices, and they wouldn't really let me know what they were talking about. But I could see that they were afraid. And a few years later, I realized why they were afraid, and that was because we were on the edge of a nuclear extermination. So that was always a part of my consciousness, and it was what motivated me to become a survivalist. Now, back then, the term prepper hadn't been coined yet, so we called ourselves survivalists. And we were expecting, and, through the movies and the TV shows and the books, On the Beach and such and so forth, we really kind of expected that the end of the world was going to arrive any day now. And so even as a young boy, I started prepping, started getting ready. I joined the Boy Scouts, and then I joined the Outward Bound Club, and then I put together my first bug-out bag when I was 15. I bought my first firearm as soon as I was allowed to legally, which was at 19 at the time. And since then, I have been investigating and researching and practicing how to be a survivalist, how to be a prepper, how to survive just about any kind of a situation, any kind of a disaster that could possibly happen. And then I joined the St. John Ambulance Corps, and I became an instructor, and we did, disaster simulation drills. I actually won a couple of mayor's awards for community service for my participation in staging disaster drills, whereby we would close down the town square. At the time it was Brampton, the town square, and we would pretend that there was a large explosion or a fire disaster or a poison gas attack, and we would coordinate with fire department and ambulance and volunteer search and rescue, and we would triage patients and secure the scene and administer first aid. And then later on, I became a wilderness instructor. I worked for the Toronto Boys Home, which was a halfway house for what we called then at-risk youth, basically guys that had just gotten out of juvenile detention, and were ready to make their entrance into the real world again. And Toronto Boys Home ran a camp up north here in Canada, up in Ontario, close to Algonquin Park, which was one of my favorites, and which is where I took most of my outward bound training as well. So because of my outward bound training, I was pretty good at wilderness survival, and that got me the job with the Toronto Boys Home. And so my job was to teach young boys, well, teenagers, 16, 17-year-old boys, that were, they all had a criminal record. They were, from street gangs and inner city toughs, and take them out into the woods and teach them how to survive and how to camp and cook over an open fire and build shelters. And it was a great experience. And I saw firsthand, too, how taking young men into the woods and training them had a huge effect on them. It increased their confidence. It brought them back down to a form of reality that you don't get when you were born and raised in the inner city. So, and all of which certainly added to my skill repertoire for survivalism. And that is why, to this day, I also speak quite a bit on survivalism and prepping, because I've been doing it for 50 years now. 50 years. So that was how it all started, my career as a prepper. Later on, of course, I studied martial arts, again, as part of my training to be combat ready. I even traveled the world studying under several great masters. I lived in China for 4 years, in Hong Kong and Taipei. I studied in Thailand, mainland China, Japan, Korea. I've been to all those places and studied martial arts there to, improve my skills. And so that's where my prepping background comes from. The next major point, the turning point, and what sort of led directly to me writing this book. By the way, you will all get a copy of the book at the end of the course, because I should be finished by the end of August. So you'll all get a free PDF copy. As a matter of fact, you'll all get a free PDF copy of my last book, The Art of Urban Survival, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the next thing that really influenced me was I went through, I was reading a lot of books, and I was in my science fiction phase, and I read a book by Isaac Asimov called The Foundation Trilogy. And the premise of the book really intrigued me, because the protagonist in the book was a historian, and he had read a lot of history, and he had somehow come up with a mathematical way to predict the future based on history. Well, I like that. At the time, I was also, studying various mystical paths, and being able to tell the future was something that I would have liked to do, and if there was a mathematical way of doing it, I certainly would be interested in. Now, I've always loved history, and I've read a lot of history, and so while I was reading history, I'm looking for the patterns that Isaac Asimov wrote about in his book, The Foundation Trilogy. Now, in the book, the protagonist found a way to predict the future, and what he discovered was that the empire that he was living in was going to collapse. And so he began to make plans on how to survive the collapse of the empire, and not only how to survive it, but how to preserve the knowledge that they had attained during the height of the empire, and allow it to continue through what was going to be a very long, dark age. No, okay, so I'm thinking about that the whole time, too. Then in Taiwan, I came across a book, and it quoted a Indian author, P.J. Sarkar, and he also had come up with a theory of historical cycles, and he's also predicting basically the collapse of Western civilization. So that intrigued me, and I continued to study history. Then, about 6 years ago, I wrote an article, actually it's an essay, for Gerald Salente's Trends Journal. And in the article, what I did was I've taken all the theories about historical cycles from all the great historians of the past, and I combined them together and came up with another theory on historical cycles, which wasn't too different from what had already been written, but it was just a little bit more condensed. And so now art imitates life. 6 years ago, well, actually it went before that, but I knew about 10 years ago that we were at the end of our empire, and that things were going to get really bad, and that we would end up going into a dark age that would last a long time. So as a survivalist, I began wondering, how am I going to survive this? Excuse me, I'm out here in the country, and we get inundated with houseflies, so they seem to love the camera. They did this the last time I did a podcast. They're always in the lens. Anyways, so now I'm recreating the story from the book, The Foundation Trilogy. I'm the historian. I've come up with my own theory on historical cycles, and I'm predicting the end of our current civilization. Typically, civilizations last about 200, 250 years. We're about at the end of that, and we can see it coming. And I think everybody listening in now understands that this is where we're going. We're going towards an ultimate collapse of our civilization, and probably entering into, I'm hoping less, but possibly a 500-year dark age. Arthur Schopenhauer predicted that at about this time we would also go into a collapse of Western civilization, but he predicted a 1,000-year dark age. We had, of course, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, a 500-year dark age, and those times was hell on earth. So basically, let's go over quickly. I just want to quickly bring you up to speed on the theory of historical cycles. So civilizations go through 4 stages. The first stage we call the warrior stage, which is the founding of the civilization. This is, the discovery of new lands, the conquering of old enemies, the establishment of new dynasties. And this is a very vibrant and good time to be alive, because they're building, they're creating, they're clearing the woods, they're, creating farms and universities. Then this era, and actually it's quite curious, it's a very masculine era, the age of warriors, but also surprisingly, it's also the time where women have the most power in a civilization, is during the warrior age. Warriors appreciate their women and give them a lot of power to participate in civilization and participate in their society. After the warrior age, we get to the intellectual age, and these are good times too. This is where the emphasis sort of shifts from conquering and building and establishing an empire to an intellectual phase where scholarship and art and intellectualism, independent thinking, all became prominent. And this is the time where universities were established and libraries were established, and things were very good in those times. The life was usually pretty good. Women's rights were pretty high. But what happens after the intellectual age is we go into what they call the merchant age. Now, during this time, money starts to become the big deal, the primary focus. Initially, everything is pretty good. Businesses are established, commerce, trade. People tend to have a little bit more money then. And this was one of the few times in history where there was such a thing as upward mobility. In other words, you could have been born a peasant, But by, starting a business and working hard, you could rise up through the ranks of society and become part of the upper class. However, what happens under the merchant age is that it eventually becomes corrupt. People become degenerate and things start to go downhill. So after the merchant age, corruption tends to be widespread, things start to fall apart. You now enter into the final stage of a civilization, which is called the stage of chaos. And what you're dealing with is basically Mad Max. Complete breakdown of society, breakdown of law and order, widespread crime and starvation, and a huge drop in the population level. During the age of chaos, many, many people died. Now this is true. This has been true for every civilization. They've all followed those 4 stages. Those 4 stages have always played out exactly the way I just described it briefly. And they are all followed by a dark age. The age of chaos can last from 50 years to 500 years. And it's just simply hell on earth. So now, I'm a prepper, I'm a survivalist. I've accurately predicted, and I think we all can agree on that we are at the end stage of this civilization, our society as we know it. We're never going back to the 1950s and 60s again. Those days are long gone. Instead, we are going into the Mad Max phase. So how do you survive? How do you survive that time? I'm prepared. I've got my skills. I got my wilderness skills. But to be honest with you, a lot of people think that we're just all going to go run to the woods and live there. But, I've been in the woods a lot. I'm a good I'm an experienced outdoorsman. It's not something you can do for too long. A couple of months, half a year, maybe a year. Members of my family during World War II actually did live in the forest for 2 years to avoid, the widespread warfare that was going on and the starvation and so forth. So it is possible to go out and live in the woods, but it's not easy. It's really tough. So how else do you survive what's coming? So again, I'm turning to history. And what I was looking at was, in the times, in past times when civilizations collapsed, how did people survive? What did they do to survive? So what happened after Rome collapsed? How did the people get along then? And, I'm very familiar with Chinese history and the dynastic cycles. And every time a dynasty collapsed, there was, again, an age of chaos, a dark age, Mad Max type of environment. And how did they survive? So this is what brought me to the current work, how to build communities. Because you will not, and why I say this is a matter of life and death, because we are definitely heading into a time of collapse. It's going to be ugly. It's going to be worse than a lot of people imagine. And you won't survive unless you're able to work together and form unique communities specifically designed to get you through the dark age. And then once the dark age is over, we're back to a new warrior age, and which is my last book, The Way of the Warrior. Once we survive this, we need tough men and women to rebuild civilization. So that's what brings me to this book, and why I think it is really an important book, because unless we're able to work together, we're not going to survive what's coming. Now here's the big problem. I've been working on finding communities. I've joined all the prepper groups and the meetup groups, and in my history of traveling around, I've joined communes and been part of other community groups. And the curious thing is, well, I suppose it's not that curious, but the curious thing is that our civilization, our current last 2, 3, 4 generations don't know how to work together. We don't know how to work as communities, as teams anymore, because the educational system and the popular culture, the mainstream media, the mainstream media, the brainwashing, has done everything in its power to separate people, to cause division amongst us so that we can't work together. You know, I do a lot of consulting on the side and consulting on how to get ready for what's coming. So, you know, get your preps together and your strategy for how to survive what's coming. And a common theme among everybody that I speak to is they can't work together anymore. Their families won't come together because they're split over, you know, whether or not they should get the vaccine or political viewpoints, or, you know, everybody's divided against each other. And if you can't even get families to work together, how are we going to get through this? So again, the need for this book, I've gone over all throughout history, and the next lesson I'll take you through that as well. You know, the entire history of communities, starting from tribal societies and going through monasteries and the communist communes, and even the hippie communes, and artists' communities, and we'll touch upon the Amish and the Mennonites, and we'll see what worked and what didn't work. Most of it didn't work, and that's why this book is going to be important, because and also this course is going to be important, because what I'm going to do is try and head off anything that's not going to work, so that you don't make the same mistakes other people throughout history have made, and so that we get on the right footing and are able to build these communities so that we can survive what's coming. So that is how I came to write this book, and why my background, I suppose, led me to this book, and why this book really is deadly serious, because we need to get it together. We need to support each other, work together. Everybody understands that, or many people understand that. I've talked to people, and they want to buy a big piece of property out in the country and start farming and bring everybody over, and it's not going to work. It's been tried, and it's failed many times in the past. So, you know, there's a lot of mistakes to be made out there. My purpose is to help everybody avoid those mistakes and be successful in building their own independent communities for mutual aid, for support, and when things are going well, for those communities to give back to society and help other people in the form of charity.